Hey everybody, my name is Andrew Trolson, and I'm going to give you a quick 5-minute overview of what to expect in the complete VB class. So the course objectives here begin by really making sure attendees understand the functionality and the scope of the .NET platform. What can you do with it? What kind of software can you build with it, and so forth. We'll be talking quite a bit about the details of the .NET type system. There are 5 fundamental things that we use to build .NET software: class, interface, structure, enum, delegate, and attendees will be exposed to the details of all 5 of these things. We'll make sure that we cover the distinction between an assembly, a namespace, and a type, including topics such as building custom namespaces and why that's important. We'll be talking quite a bit about object-oriented development using Visual Basic. For those of you that are coming to the class with a background in VB6 or prior, you're aware that Visual Basic was always object-aware, but not quite fully object-oriented. So here we're going to make sure that we go through all the details of inheritance, encapsulation, and polymorphism. We'll learn the syntax and the need for .NET generics. We'll understand what benefits they bring. We'll talk about the format of a .NET assembly. That will really help you better understand how the runtime is manipulating your libraries at runtime. We'll talk about how to deploy assemblies, how to version them, and how to configure them with XML configuration files. We're also going to be talking about a couple of topics that work together. We're going to be talking about reflection as a core API of the platform, but then we're going to see reflection doing some very interesting things, and we're going to learn how to build extensible software using some related topics such as late binding, dynamic loading, and how to create custom attributes. We'll talk about file I/O services and object serialization, how to build graphical user interfaces for the desktop using Windows Forms. We have a couple of chapters dedicated to relational database programming using ADO.NET. And then we're going to wrap things up with an introduction to ASP.NET, which is the web development platform of the framework. When it comes to prerequisites for attendees, first of all, everybody's welcome. But you'll probably find yourself the best equipped to succeed if you understand that this is an intensive programming course. So we are going to be doing a good amount of lab time where we're going to be writing some pretty good, interesting software. We assume that you have familiarity working with graphical IDEs. It doesn't have to be Visual Studio per se, but something in that ballpark. As much OO concepts that you can bring to the table, the better. Again, this doesn't assume that you've done a whole bunch of Visual Basic .NET, but the more experience with some fundamental ideas will be helpful, such as what is a class, what can I do with it. Knowledge of XML and SQL will also be helpful when we start to work with relational databases and when we start to deploy and configure assemblies. The class is a pretty good split between lecture time, demonstrations with the students, and then formal lab work. Now these are just kind of some estimates that you see on the screen, but typically a class would have about 60% lecture and demo and about 40% labs. We do provide solutions for all the labs, so that's certainly yours to keep as well. Now here's a breakdown of the actual content on a more chapter by chapter level. As mentioned, Chapter 1 is going to give a nice firm foundation into what the platform is able to do. We'll talk about the role of the CLR. We'll talk about the common type system. In Chapter 2, we'll be looking at Visual Basic for the first time, including a very brief compare and contrast between older constructs in previous versions of BASIC and how that's been changed under the .NET platform. Chapter 3 is where we're going to be talking quite a bit about object-oriented programming, and that's where we're going to see lots of details about the pillars of OOP encapsulation, inheritance, and polymorphism. And then Chapter 4 is going to really kind of give you that well-rounded edge when it comes to the full aspects of the .NET type system. Here we'll talk about things like delegates and events, we'll talk about value types and reference types, and a number of other important topics that you should be familiar with. Chapter 5 is the last chapter on core syntax. That's where we'll be talking about generics. Chapter 6 is more about how to deploy, version, and configure your software. In Chapter 7, that's where we're going to talk about building extensible software using a collection of slightly more advanced programming techniques, but very, very useful in the real world. We'll talk about UI development with Windows Forms, file I/O and object serialization. As mentioned, we have 2 chapters on ADO.NET, which is the data access paradigm. And then we're going to wrap it all up with an introduction to ASP.NET. Now, when it comes to what you need to attend the class, thankfully the install is pretty simple. As long as you have a copy of Visual Studio 2010, you're going to have everything you need. When you install 2010, SQL Server Express installs by default. So you'll be just fine for the database portion of the class. But if you have a full version of Microsoft SQL Server, that would be fine too. And then all you need beyond that is just a browser of your choice for the component on ASP.NET. So, as you can see, the class is a nice full week of information. Hope to see you in class.